Good morning. I thought I'd be a little nervous, but I'm probably still a little nervous, but I'm really glad to be here. First of all, I want to say I'm very grateful to be able to share my art here in such a beautiful space with such a beautiful community. Several years ago, I began to be inspired by the Flaming Chalice, and I thought that it might be a lot of fun to create a new earring design using my paper art technique. This happens to be my very first design. Um, that eventually led to me seeing a flaming chalice everywhere, like in everyday life, in landscapes. Um, and now I find myself eager to create new art that features flaming chalice with multiple layers of symbolism and meanings. And you might see that in some of my art. Some of it's not so obvious, and some it's very obvious. As I began to be curious about the flaming chalice, I read about its origins and found many articles about it and how it became a symbol for the Unitarian Universalists. A man named Hans Deutsch, if I'm saying that correctly, originally drew a simple chalice with a flame rising from it. There's been many interpretations created about the flaming chalice and what it symbolizes. In one interpretation, the chalice is a symbol of religious freedom from hierarchy and an openness of participation by everyone. The flame symbolizes a memorial to those throughout history who have sacrificed their lives for religious freedom. Another interpretation includes the light, the light of reason and the warmth of community, and the flame of hope. I certainly resonate with all of those interpretations. Personally, the flaming chalice is a symbol of passion and purpose, with the chalice representing my community that I live in and give in. The flame is the energy and the life force that motivates me into actions that contribute to the world, however small or large, to make positive difference in whatever way I possibly can. Plus, it sparks my own inquiry about how to understand and embody my birth name, Flame. That is a part of my own origin story and my life's path as an advocate for healing and inspiration and empowerment. When I was born in Southern California, I was born 2 weeks early and very quickly, and my mother said she thought she was giving birth to a fireball. So she named me Flame. Now you all know the story. And now it reminds me to ask the question of myself, how can I be of service while I'm here? And what is my spiritual evolution moving me towards? In the Unitarian Universalist tradition, the flame itself represents the spirit of helpfulness and sacrifice, and I'm inspired by these ideas and strive to express this in my everyday life. Also, I tend to find it fairly easy to see the good in other people. Usually, I'm happy with this aspect of my personality. I like to think that I see everyone's light within them. With most people, I am compelled to extend a belief in their core goodness. I also extend the belief I extend the benefit of doubt when I'm engaged in a conflict or something that's difficult in a relationship. While creating art, I am often thinking about how will this piece inspire someone? In my current series of art, I am exploring light as a possible guide, an accent, a focal point, and how so many beautiful ways it illuminates our lives. Whether I paint a chalice or a landscape, I am finding metaphors that represent the flaming chalice everywhere.
Thank you, Flame. That was wonderful. So, yeah, I don't know if I've experienced Flame as quite as a ball of fire, but maybe I think it's just that is such a wonderful story. I'm so glad you shared that with us. So I just want to begin by telling all of you how we got here this morning. So a couple of months ago, Flame sent me an email saying that she was going to be the featured artist in September and October, and that the chalice, the Flaming Chalice, would be featured in a good number of her works. Flame went on to ask if it would be possible to lift up the chalice during a service at some point, maybe with a reading or with a hymn that would be connected to the chalice. So I thought, well, that sounds interesting. So of course I invited Flame to come in for a chat. And as I listened to her describe why she had chosen to feature the chalice in her work and what the chalice means to her, much like what you just heard, I quickly came to see that a reading or a hymn just wasn't going to do it. That we needed to have and dedicate an entire service to the chalice. And as you just experienced in listening to Flame's wonderful reflection, I realized that we needed her voice in this service and her story as well. So thank you, Flame, for your amazing art, for sending me that email, for having such a wonderful idea, and for being willing to share your story with all of us. I love it when those kinds of moments in congregational life come together. It's just so wonderful. And let me just say that much of what Flame said about what the chalice means to her really resonates for me. During my over 25 years as a Unitarian Universalist, I have come to see the Flaming Chalice, as she said so well, as a symbol of both passion and purpose. For me, the chalice symbolizes the community and love that holds me and that offers me and all of us a spiritual home. I also see the flame as a kind, which again, I'm going to agree with what Flame said, kind of spark and energy that inspires me and I think all of us to make a positive difference and to bring the light of my gifts, our gifts and passion into a larger Unitarian Universalist flame of love and justice for all. I also want to commend Flame for your historical research about the chalice and for sharing some of the details of how it became the symbol of Unitarian Universalism. And since I am a dyed-in-the-wool UU history nerd, I thought I'd take a couple of minutes just to fill in a little bit more detail about what Flame was telling us about the story of the chalice and how the chalice became so central in Unitarian Universalism. And this is a story of courage and dedication, of spiritual connection and community, and a story of liberation and transformation. So as Flame mentioned a few minutes ago, the image of a flaming chalice was first created by an Austrian artist named Hans Deutsch during the early years of the Second World War. But really the story of how Deutsch came to design and draw that first chalice goes back a few years earlier. During the mid and late 1930s, many Unitarians and Universalists, and this was back in the day when they were two separate religious traditions, many Unitarians and Universalists grew increasingly concerned about the rise of fascism and the growing threats facing a number of communities in Europe, including and especially European Jews. A number of Unitarian leaders, including this man, a man named Charles Joy, got together and decided to start a new organization which would help people facing persecution escape from Europe. That new organization came to be called the Unitarian Service Committee. That's Charles Joy. And one of the first things that Charles Joy did, and those other leaders did, was to recruit and to send two very brave and courageous people a husband and wife team, Martha and Waitstill Sharp, to Europe to help those facing persecution and possibly death, help them escape fascist tyranny. Now, prior to taking this pretty dangerous assignment, the Sharps were married, as I said, had 2 wonderful children, and lived in Wellesley, Massachusetts, where Waitstill was the minister at the local Unitarian church and Martha was a social worker. Life for the Sharps was pretty good, and they felt very blessed and grateful for what they had. But when Charles Joy asked the Sharps to go to Europe, it would have been so easy for them to say, and this is probably what I would have said, I agree things are really bad, but I've got a lot going on, a lot of sermons to preach, a lot of commitments and responsibilities, so I just don't think I can do it. But that wasn't Martha and Waitstill Sharp. They looked at all the people who were suffering and how they might be able to help, and they just had to live their Unitarian faith and values, which centered on freedom of conscience, tolerance and acceptance rather than persecution of difference, and of course, the dignity of all people. So the Sharps dropped everything and left for Europe and began years of courageous work to help people escape from fear and persecution. It's really impossible to estimate how many people were saved because of the Sharps' work. The estimates have been from 500 to as many as I've seen as many as 5,000. And for their courageous work, and that's the Sharps on the left there, for their courageous work, they were recognized a few years ago as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem in Israel, only the 2nd and 3rd Americans to ever receive that honor. Now, when the Sharps arrived in Europe and once they began their work, it soon became clear that the newly formed organization, the Unitarian Service Committee, needed some kind of a symbol that would be recognized by those who were trying to help, and that could be stamped on important papers to make it easier for people to get past security officials, guards, and border crossings. It's sort of like something like the Red Cross had, but of course not a Red Cross. That led Charles Joy to contact Hans Deutsch, who already had a reputation for being something of using his art as in outspoken criticism of fascism and the Nazi regime. And that's what led Joy to approach Hans Deutsch. Deutsch was not a Unitarian, but he greatly admired the work our religion was doing on behalf of people of other faiths and nationalities. So Deutsch designed this very simple, very elegant flaming chalice, and that symbol became a beacon of hope for those who were trying to escape Nazi persecution. As Flame said a minute ago, early interpretations, and I think the one that Charles Joy especially put on Deutsch's drawing, talked about how the chalice resembled the sacred lamps of oil used by ancient Greeks and Romans, and that the flame symbolized helpfulness and sacrifice. And that simple design became a symbol of hope and safe passage, as I said, for refugees in Europe. And over time, the flaming chalice has become the symbol, in my view, of all that is good and decent in Unitarian Universalism. And I want to take the story up to today. This part of the story has been written down and is reasonably well known. How we got from a symbol that was stamped on documents in World War II to today, that story isn't as well known, and I want to just take a minute to tell you that story as well. So after the war ended, the flaming chalice became sort of the symbol of the forerunner of our denomination today, the American Unitarian Association. And then after the Unitarians and the Universalists merged in 1961, a somewhat redesigned chalice became the symbol of our tradition. But it was still, as I understand it, a symbol on paper. It was two-dimensional. How did we get here? The story of how the flaming chalice, I guess I would say, went from 2 dimensions to 3 is less well known, but it's equally important and inspiring. This is what I have cobbled together and what I have learned, that it was Unitarian Universalist women who began meeting in spiritual connection groups in the late 1960s and early 1970s, who began lighting a flame at the beginnings of their gatherings. And soon the flame became part of a chalice. Those simple groups planted the seed for what became the very impactful women's spirituality movement in Unitarian Universalism, a movement whose influence absolutely transformed our faith. It was those groups and that movement that developed and eventually inspired so many of the rituals that we share to this day, including our ritual of water communion, the sharing of joys and sorrows, and of course, lighting and extinguishing the flaming chalice. I would also add that some of the same Unitarian Universalist women who those same women boldly and courageously challenged patriarchal structures and language that was rampant in Unitarian Universalism throughout our history. Their activism led to the adoption of new principles and purposes that were gender inclusive and opened the doors of the ministry to women. From having barely any ordained female ministers 50 or 60 years ago, the majority of Unitarian Universalist ministers today are women. From those courageous UU women, the story of the Flaming Chalice took another important turn as it went from being part of their small spiritual gatherings to a cornerstone of congregational worship and congregational life. We begin to see that happening in the 1980s. And for that, we have another wonderful demographic of Unitarian Universalists to thank: our children and youth and religious education programs. You see, flaming chalices, as far as we know, were first used in religious education programs at the congregational level. And when youth would do like an annual or semi-annual youth service, they would bring those flaming chalices into, pardon the expression, big church, and they would light a chalice during their youth-led services. And the chalice flame, sorry, pardon the expression, caught on. And now, and now, of course, almost every Unitarian Universalist congregation you go in, small groups, gatherings, board meetings, light a flaming chalice to remind themselves of who we are and that they are gathered together on sacred ground. So let me just conclude this morning with one final thought about something I especially love about the story of the chalice and about the chalice itself. Earlier, you heard Flame share what the chalice means to her, and I did the same. Our understandings had a lot in common, but they were also slightly different. And what I love most about Unitarian Universalism is that in our tradition, Flame and I can have different understandings of the chalice, and those differences are welcomed and celebrated rather than corrected or excluded or rejected. Just like our approach to questions like the existence of God or gods or the meaning of ultimate reality, there is no single correct or required way of understanding the flaming chalice. We don't have a creed for our flaming chalice. We don't have a creed at all. The flame of the chalice is set in a cup. It's not set in stone. Every Unitarian Universalist is free to draw wisdom and meaning from the chalice in a way that touches their heart and stirs their soul. Now, while I feel confident that the flaming chalice will remain part of Unitarian Universalism for many years to come, how it is understood, how it is incorporated into our spiritual lives will undoubtedly evolve, grow, and change. That, friends, is what we mean when we say our faith is a living tradition. And that aliveness, that freedom to grow, to be curious, and to be transformed, that for me is the beauty and the blessing of Unitarian Universalism. Amen, and blessed be.